Hello everyone and welcome to this NICEC online seminar, a Bill Law retrospective. Bill Law was the founding fellow of NICEC, and in today's session we have presenters David Andrews, Phil McCash, Hazel Reid and Anthony Barnes, who are each going to share a perspective on Bill's life and work, its influence and its relevance to the current context of careers work today. So I'm going to hand over to David to introduce the rest of the session.
I was really pleased to have the opportunity to coordinate and chair this particular seminar. I think we're overwhelmed by the number of registrations. We had over 120 reservations for this event. My screen at the bottom tells me we've got 91 participants so far. I suspect that will increase as more people come in. So it's actually moved on from being a seminar and more to be like a plenary series of presentations at a conference. That might have some implications, actually, seriously. It might have some implications for how we handle the discussion and the questions and answers bit that we've timed at the end of the session. But absolutely delighted to chair and coordinate this. I think that we found during the current crisis that obviously going online has increased the uptake of sessions because it's just more accessible for people to attend a 1.5 hour seminar online than it is to travel to London. But I suspect it's not just that that's the reason for the number of registrations we've got, it's the topic and dealing with Bill's work. As one of my colleague presenters, Hazel, said, it's good to see that Bill can still pull in a crowd. And that crowd is not just from the UK, it's international as well. I understand Reid Thompson has got a little group over in Denmark that are having a Bill Law film night with pizza this evening. They're an hour ahead of us, so, and they're a lot way ahead of us in terms of dealing with the current crisis. They're able to get together for this session and share popcorn and pizza for the evening. I just want to say also that within the UK, we won't have time to introduce everybody clearly, but I too am really delighted that one of Stephen's sons, Stephen, was able to join us this evening, and you've already met Stephen. Tony Watts was planning to sign in. I haven't seen him sign in yet, but I'm sure he has. One of Bill's colleagues from way back from the Schools Council Careers Education and Guidance Project, John Story, is joining us. And I was probably upset people if I missed people out, but I also saw Barbara McGowan image up in the top of my screen there, and Barbara, of course, worked with Bill on many projects over the years. I want to say, as I said, I was pleased to have the opportunity to coordinate and chair this session. And I think, like many of you, I will have a particular personal perspective to this, as well as a professional perspective. I first met Bill in 1981. I was a newly appointed, what would now be called a careers leader. I was called head of careers at the time. And I embarked on a 2-year part-time diploma in career education and guidance at Hatfield Polytechnic, where Bill had joined the staff a few years earlier as a lecturer, but immediately on joining Hatfield Polytechnic staff in the 70s, Bill was seconded off to NICEC, and NICEC was set up as a joint enterprise between Hatfield Polytechnic and CRAC. And as soon as Bill was recruited to the Polytechnic, he was seconded to NICEC. A secondment that lasted 17 years, and he often said he had the record for the longest secondment ever. It actually lasted right through till 1992, when Hatfield Polytechnic, like all other polytechnics, was incorporated as a university and became the University of Hertfordshire, and at the time decided it didn't want to be supporting of NICEC anymore. So I met Bill on that course in 1981, and for the next 36 years he remained a friend and mentor for me throughout my professional career, and so that's why I have a particular interest in this evening. The way we're going to work this, I'm going to make a few opening remarks, and then I've got 3 NICEC colleagues who are going to make presentations on aspects of Bill's work. And then we'll have time at the end when I suspect it won't be so much questions and more inviting people just to make their own contribution. I suspect a lot of you will have, well, I know you'll all have your personal, particular favourite bits of Bill's work that you're interested in and may well want to make some comments. But if I could just make a few introductory remarks before handing over to the first of those three main presentations. I'm just trying to move my slides on. As you all know, because by signing up to this seminar, you're obviously interested in Bill's work. I think his principal interests were curriculum and schools and staff development. And that's no surprise because Bill was and remained throughout his professional life a teacher. He would always introduce himself as a teacher. That isn't to say that was the only thing he was interested in, curriculum and schools and staff development. He also had a strong interest in career counselling. In fact, one of his early jobs in a school was to be a school counsellor. And he's left us with the community interaction theory. He's left us with his interest in narrative approaches, and one of our speakers is picking up those perspectives, as well as other speakers picking up the curriculum issues. When I think about Bill and his work, there's many things I remember. One of the things, my overriding impression, of course, is that he was very forward-thinking, very creative, and always ahead of us. I think we're all still trying to catch up with him. And that's the reason for organising this seminar 3 years after Bill sadly left us. It's to examine the relevance of his work to our work, not just today, but today and tomorrow. We'll all have our favourite bits of his work, and I just want to give my example before handing over to Phil. A lot of you, I suspect everybody, would have at some point seen, read or heard of Schools, Careers and Community, 1977, Law and Watts. I suspect it's one of the most frequently referenced books in articles and publications about careers work because people use it as a reference for the DOTS framework. And Phil is going to be talking about the DOTS framework and other curriculum dimensions in a minute. The DOTS framework, of course, was setting out the overall aims for a careers education and guidance programme in schools. But what's often overlooked in that book is another framework that Bill presented, which was his framework of the provision that schools might put in place to meet those aims. And I'm just going to remind ourselves of that framework. He called it the stages in the development of guidance in schools. And I can still see him now in a workshop one Saturday morning in Peterborough. Barbara was there as well, when he took us through this story. And I'm not going to repeat the story, but I'm just going to put the headlines up. The framework in 1977 in Bill's work was this. He would talk about careers work starting with a cardboard box of leaflets sent from COEC. And that one day somebody organised those leaflets into a careers library. He would then go on and talk about how a pupil took out one of these leaflets and asked a teacher about it, and that was the first careers interview. So schools developed a provision of information, then developed their provision of individual interviewing, used first mainly advice, moving into counselling approaches, then realising actually some of this information could be passed over more efficiently in group settings, so that and that was the beginning of curriculum work, group talks on careers, bits of careers information. Then he would talk about schools developing their discrete, separate provision of careers education, and that's where the DOTS framework came in. And then talking about that the most advanced stages of development would be integrating this provision, not only into other aspects of the life of the school, both in terms of curriculum and co-curricular, extracurricular activities, but also integrating it into the resources that were available in the community, not least through such activities as work experience. That was a framework describing the provision of career education and guidance in schools in 1977. Now let me take you forward 37 years, where we have another framework that describes the provision of careers, education and guidance in schools that also happens to have 8 components. The Gatsby benchmarks, published 37 years after Schools, Careers and Community in 2014, are very much driving what is happening predominantly in England, in our schools at the moment, but also being picked up elsewhere as people take an interest in the Gatsby benchmarks and what they might mean in their context. And I've done a little bit of analysis of linking that earlier framework that Bill came up with and 37 years later, the Gatsby benchmarks. And I think they're almost describing the same thing. If you look at those 8 components, I've mapped against them where the current benchmarks fit in, and they describe the same sets of provision, except one important difference. Look at item 3.2, careers education, curriculum provision. If you look at the Gatsby benchmarks, it's the bit that's missing. The benchmark 4 talks about the integration of careers education into other subjects. It doesn't talk about having that discrete provision alongside it, which enables us as a school to deliver those bits of careers education that won't fit in neatly into other subjects, and also, more importantly, provides a space in which we can bring together all those cross-curricular elements. So this is my example of Bill thinking ahead. He was ahead of the benchmarks, and I think the benchmarks have still got to catch up with him by putting item 3.2, discrete careers education, back into the framework. That's my personal perspective. I'm just illustrating Bill's work being ahead of us catching up with it. And what I'd now like to do is introduce the first of our 3 presentations where other NICEC Fellows are going to consider different aspects of Bill's work and talk about how it's relevant to our work today and in the immediate future. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen in a minute and hand over to Phil, who's going to talk about Bill's particular interest in curriculum.
Tremendous honour to speak at this seminar on Bill Law. As the founding fellow of NICEC, Bill's ideas are central to NICEC and the evolution of career development in Britain and elsewhere. He's one of the reasons NICEC is a society for career education and counselling. It's also a considerable responsibility to speak today in front of family, friends and colleagues. Bill influenced many people, and each will have their own memories of him and views on his legacy. My selection this evening is inevitably partial, time constrained to 20 minutes, and reflective of my own views and preferences. Members of the audience are very welcome to add their own memories and views in the chat box, and we'll aim to share those too. I think the last time I saw Bill was at a NICEC event. The roundtable discussion turned to that old chestnut of how career helpers can help clients with job interviews. A number of fairly routine suggestions were made. Then Bill added that he used to ask the client or student, how do you want to be remembered by the interviewers? How would you like them to remember you? That's a neat illustration of Bill's creative and unusual way of looking at things. It wasn't something I'd come across in the interview guides that I'd read. I also found it quite moving, both at the time and when I learned of his passing. If I may, I'd like to share with you now how I remember Bill Law, initially in terms of the personal, and then, as this is primarily a seminar, in terms of his intellectual contribution. I remember him as an excellent speaker, credible, warm, engaging. He could change the atmosphere in the room. I remember that he'd sometimes speak at conferences and events in Essex, where I first worked as a careers advisor. No matter how beleaguered and ground down were by government directives and targets, he always helped us to see our work as useful, interesting, and important. I remember him as a collegial and supportive person. He supported my early work, even though I was critical of the DOTS model, and he supported my fellowship nomination for NICEC and encouraged me to edit the NICEC journal. I remember that no one writes like Bill Law. His distinctive style is rangy, engaging, and creative. He was a great reader, a polymath, with his work often marshalling reading from a very wide range of sources, such as Jean-Paul Sartre, Arthur Koestler, and Jeanette Winterson. Occasionally it became too much, but more often than not, it was an education. He also had a gift for memorable phrases. Who could forget, once they'd heard it, that career development is about who does what in society and possible selves in possible futures. I remember Bill as a brilliant and preeminent career theorist, whose work is of international importance. Those of us who write in the career development field can count ourselves lucky if we produce one influential set of ideas. Bill had the distinction of producing a hatful of seminal theories and papers. In this respect, he was like a British version of Donald Super. He assembled a range of theories over the years. And it's perhaps only now that we can see how they all fit together and assess the scale of his achievement. 3 of these theories, DOTS, community interaction, and career learning, provide the focus of my talk. I'll argue that his work responds to 5 central questions in career theory: the who, what, how, where, and why of career development. I'll also briefly discuss some limitations of his work, but that is not my main focus today. Bill writes on DOTS in the book School, Careers and Community in collaboration with Tony Watts. Although Bill's very much associated with DOTS, it was Tony and Peter Dawes who first developed the DOTS framework. Law and Watts make 3 key arguments in the book. 1, the importance of career education. To quote them, careers education ceases to see the school's central task as being that of providing diagnostic services. Instead, helping students to develop the skills and acquire the concepts and information that will help them make decisions for themselves. This is not only a much more ambitious task, it is also a much more essentially educational one, for it focuses attention not on the diagnostic skill of the careers advisor, but on student learning. Number 2 were the tasks of career education, namely, of course, self-awareness, opportunity awareness, decision learning, and transition learning, and I'll come back to those. Number 3 was guidance as a community enterprise, which David has already alluded to. They express some skepticism around teachers and careers professionals taking too much control in the education of children. They write, the community has a right to participate in the upbringing of its young. They propose an integrated model where the career lead acts as a coordinator and facilitator of school and community resources and sources of help. DOTS is a theory that finds a central role for learning. Each of the contents of DOTS relates to learning, particularly opportunity, decisions, and transitions. DOTS is primarily a theory about the content, i.e. the what of learning. It relates to coverage, as Bill added later in the CPI model. It sees learning about the 4 key topics taking place, yes, within the school and within the formal curriculum in explicitly designed lessons. But it also sees learning taking place outside of the formal curriculum in the everyday life of the school. Even more significantly, it sees learning taking place outside the school itself. So people are seen as learning about the 4 topics in wider community life, such as family life and time with friends and peers outside the school gates. So in this sense, like Bill's other theories, it's a very special kind of career theory because it's both descriptive, it makes claims about what happens, and it's practice focused. It makes claims about what we should do to help. It asserts that the important aspect of career we need to keep an eye on is that people learn about self, opportunity, transitions and decisions through formal and informal learning inside and outside formal education. That's a claim about what happens, for good or for ill. But at the same time, it's also what we used to call a model of guidance, because it makes claims about what career development work should aim to do and achieve. It's a claim about what we should do to help people. In addition, it unites different forms of career development work, such as one-to-one career interviews and group-based career lessons. It defines what those activities should be aiming to do collectively. It sets out the scope and content of those activities, i.e. they should all work to facilitate learning on the 4 topics. Not only that, it provides a framework for evaluating career education programs, certainly up to a point. For example, Law and Watts found that the schools they studied tended to focus on opportunity awareness and neglect self-awareness, transitions and decisions. So DOTS does an awful lot for a relatively simple theory. It appeals to practitioners who want their theory to go a long way, who want bangs for their bucks. It suggests that when we create theory in the future, as we must, it should be similarly useful. Rolls-Royce analysis with horse and cart practice will not be enough. Finally, DOTS is synthetic. That is, it is made up of elements from existing career theories. The main ones are Holland's matching, Ken Roberts' opportunity structure, and Super's self-concept theories. Arguably, there's more of matching and opportunity structure in DOTS than anything. But the main point I'd like to argue for the career development professionals of the future is that we need to help them be similarly creative in relation to designing the content of career education. Theory cannot supply a final proof as to the content of education, but it can provide clues as to coverage and scope. There are limits to the scope of DOTS, and even when it was first created, Tony Watts argued that it only related to the exploration phase within Super's developmental model. Nowadays, we would further question the limited scope of coverage. It no longer has the field to itself, and there are lots of competing claims about career management. To name just a few, Herminia Ibarra has flipped DOTS on its head. Zella King has focused on career management skills that are useful in the workplace. Tristram Hooley and others have argued there needs to be more focus on the topic of power in career education. There are also limits as to how far DOTS can be used to assess career education because it lacks an explicit attention to learning process. I'm just going to move my slide on a bit. To an extent, these weaknesses begin to be addressed in community interaction theory. This is another synthetic theory. It attempts to find a middle way between opportunity structure and self-concept theory. Additionally, it draws from a wide range of other sources, including Basil Bernstein's Sociology of Education and R.J. Roberts' Interactionist Career Theory. Community interaction adds 4 elements: motivation, interaction, which he phrased as modifying social functioning, the range of communities, and modes of community influence, namely expectations, feedback, support, modeling, and information. It's argued that through these 4 elements, we learn about self, opportunities, decisions, and transitions. I remember inviting Bill to speak with my students when I first started lecturing on training courses for career development practitioners. He delivered a great talk and the students loved him. I recall him saying that there are 2 interviews when a client goes for a job. First, there's the informal interview with the client's family and peers when they first discuss possibly going for the job. Then there's the formal interview with the company. If the client can't get past the informal interview, they never even make it to the formal one. So our work needs to help clients with both types of interaction, the informal and the formal. Community interaction adds some social learning process, but the main contribution in my view is to expand the scope of contents, the what of learning. Time and again, I've witnessed practitioners do great work by simply enabling clients to map their communities and influences using a version of the simple grid included in Bill's paper. It can be used across the social spectrum in inner city schools, private schools, universities, the workplace, and informal contexts. It enables clients to reflect on their biography so far, learn from the biographies of others, and work out what to keep or change. It invites taking a decontextualized, individualized, and culture-free approach to self-awareness. Community interaction highlights the role of place in career development, the where of learning. Those places include family spaces, neighborhood, education, and work. In his later formulation, this extended to places on the World Wide Web. The theory highlights the role of people in career development, the who of learning. Those people include parents, extended family, neighborhood contacts, peer groups, ethnic groups, educational staff, work colleagues. The inclusion of people and places allow the exploration and acknowledgement of relational and emotional dimensions in career development work. Community interaction consistently flagged up the importance of culture and the role of class, gender, and ethnicity. Bill was influenced by Ken Roberts and Basil Bernstein's work on class for sure, but perhaps most significant was the influence of cultural studies. Paul Willis's Learning to Labour, How Working Class Kids Get Working Class Jobs, is returned to repeatedly because it draws from lived experience to show how the cultural celebration of a group of working class youngsters leads to the factory gates. Ethnicity is also a strong theme in community interaction. Ethnic group is identified as one of the key communities we're all part of. We're asked to reflect on the ways in which ethnicity relates to expectations, feedback, support, modelling, and information, and is mediated by the other communities we are part of. At the same time, Bill was always cautious about simply reducing people to a class, gender, or ethnic category. He was more interested in the ways that the 5 modes of community influence could, in his words, lead to occupational achievement, which big picture sociological categories do not predict. Lastly, in terms of the discipline as a whole, community interaction brings career development home. That is, it relocates career development within the interactionist sociological tradition that gave birth to the study of career in the pioneering Chicago School of Sociology in the 1920s and 30s. This is most evident in the title of his community interaction theory, that word, interaction. It can also be seen in his drawing from R.J. Roberts' interactionist thinking, credited by Bill as the closest approach to the formulation of community interaction theory in his words. Bill also cites George Herbert Mead, Herbert Blumer, and the symbolic interactionist tradition in his chapter on theory in career development in Britain. It's perhaps no accident that on final publication in 1980, Donald Super's Life Career Rainbow had a more sociological and interactionist flavour than originally conceived. His time with NICEC Fellows, including Bill in the late 1970s, helped to move it in that direction. I speculate that the more sociological bent of career thinking in Britain, particularly the interactionist variant endorsed by Bill and R.J. Roberts, reminded Super of his early engagement in the 1950s and 60s with interactionist ideas. Structure certainly features in the Life Career Rainbow, but the main contributions relate to life spaces and life roles. Nowadays, there are more extensive approaches to the topics raised by community interaction. A good example is provided by Wendy Patton and Mary McMahon's mapping exercise on the My system of career influences. Having said that, there's something about the simplicity of Bill's grid that practitioners and clients still find very accessible. Space and place have also recently been taken up by Rosie Alexander in her work linking geography and career development. Community interaction could also say more about how people learn, and it's to this that I'll turn next. Career learning is a theory about learning processes. It relates to the how of learning, and it describes 4 dimensions of learning: sensing, sifting, focusing, and understanding. It's another synthetic theory informed by Krumboltz's social learning theory and Hodgkinson and Sparks' careership theory. Its main claim to fame is that it's the first career theory to be thoroughly grounded in learning theories. For sure, the social learning, social cognitive, and information processing theories from the USA predated it, but these were rather narrowly conceived in theoretical terms. There were also learning theories emerging with a career dimension. But career learning is a thoroughgoing attempt to bridge career studies and mainstream educational theory. It is constructed from a very wide range of learning theories, such as Jean Piaget, Jacques Mezerow, George Kelly, and Sarah Meadows. It also recognizes that learning is not monolithic, but textured. There is progression in learning from sensing information. What other theory includes the smell and taste of career? To making comparisons and anticipating consequences. There is movement from private constructs to public concepts. There is also epistemological progression from the God's own truth of facts and rules to dealing with points of view and developing one's own stance, something he memorably describes as living dangerously. The issue of gender stereotyping is discussed in career learning. Bill traces how impressions about gender and work are initially formed, recognized, reflected on, and changed. Career learning makes space for meaning and purpose, the why of learning. This is discussed earlier in community interaction in relation to motivation. But career learning takes this further in relation to narrative. As people gather information through sight, sound, touch, and smell and taste, they assemble what they find into sequences called stories. For example, information about roles such as customer, shopkeeper, parents, and friends is assembled into stories that link these roles in dramatic episodes. Hazel Reid will discuss narrative in more depth later. His interest in narrative is not, however, confined to the immediately interpersonal. He saw all forms of culture as stories and therefore viable community resources. This included classical literature, philosophy, biography, TV shows, movies, novels, and songs. He wrote, "Literature from classical myth to television soap opera offers other people's stories as a clue to our own. And people should be helped through reflection on their own and other people's biographies to become their own career development theoreticians." This last quote really throws down the gauntlet to career development practitioners and tests our commitment to pluralism and learning goals. We need to design careers work that enables clients to develop their own ideas. In the final analysis, the sign that we're doing great work might be that our clients end up disagreeing with us. Career learning certainly had an impact in the UK and elsewhere. Careers work in schools, colleges, and youth centres. It could not fully displace the preeminence of the American learning tradition based on Bandura and Hunt. For example, social cognitive theory is now more in the ascendancy, perhaps because the American tradition is more counselling based than pedagogic. Career learning is possibly more focused on learning in children and young people than adults, so its application more widely was limited. The main paper on career learning is very learned, but quite a dense read. In a later paper, he linked the 4 dimensions of career learning to learning verbs and improved the practical utility of the model. My final thoughts. Bill was an original and creative thinker who helped to revolutionize the theory and practice of career development work by giving it a more sociological and educational basis. He never felt that theories were eternal. He argued we need to continually harvest the insights of the past and make it new for the times we live in. I've been working with NICEC Fellows Pete Robertson and Tristram Hooley on a new Oxford Handbook of Career Development due out this autumn. Our starting point was rethinking careers education and guidance, with which Bill was heavily involved. One of my chapters draws on Bill's work to develop a cultural learning theory linked to the 5 questions earlier: the who, the what, the how, the where, and the why of career development. Another contributor, Julia Yates, draws on career learning theory to develop an integrative approach to career theory. These are our attempts to build on Bill's legacy. Thank you.
At this point, I'm looking to Michael. I think we said at this point we'd have a 5-minute pause, but literally just a 5-minute pause. Is that correct, Michael?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, David, and thank you also to Phil for your presentations. There are 2 further presentations to come after the break. We're going to take a 5-minute short break. I'm going to pause the recording at this point. So welcome back, everyone, from the break, and I'm just going to hand back over to David to introduce Hazel.
Okay, thank you very much for coming back, and some very supportive and kind comments in the chat room. We've had a small technical difficulty to deal with during the break, and we've resolved it. So I'm really pleased that I can introduce our next speaker. Otherwise, the whole session would just be on curriculum, and it's nice to have this balanced with Bill's interest in counselling approaches, and really pleased that recently retired Hazel Reid is NICEC Fellow, is very keen to come back and accepted the invitation straight away to make this presentation. So I'm going to share the screen and her slides, and Hazel will tell me when to change the slides. So I'm going to try that now, and over to you, Hazel.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you for being my assistant in the spangly tights, if that worked, and for putting the slides on screen. And thank you, Michael, for sorting out some way that I could actually participate in this. So first of all, I wanted to thank David and colleagues at NICEC for inviting me to take part in this retrospective. It is, as Phil said before me, it is a real honour. I'd say a lot about how I first met Bill and my professional relationship with Bill, but if I do, I might start blubbing. So I think I better just concentrate on the presentation. I did change the title slightly. I didn't ask anyone, but I thought to have it just about narrative approaches to career counselling doesn't by any means encompass the work that Bill achieved over his lifetime in career. So I changed it to career education and counselling, as you can see there. Next slide, please, David. So, oh, that's it. So when I first thought about this, once I got over the excitement of being asked, I suddenly thought, well, what am I going to talk about? And I thought the best thing to do is to go back in order to move forward, perhaps, and to think about some of Bill's ideas when we're also applying them in a contemporary context. So I went back to the first major conference that we had at Canterbury Christ Church within the centre, which was in 2002, and that's the picture on the left of your screen of the publication that we produced the year after in 2003, so Challenging Biographies. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that publication and then follow that with something that was in October 2017, the NICEC Journal, which was our commemorative and celebratory piece on Bill's life. So the Challenging Biographies conference had 3 speakers: myself, who talked about narrative and career counselling, which was very new to me at the time, not new in the sector, of course. The lovely Audrey Collin had been talking about interpretive approaches for years with her work with Richard Young, for example. Lyndon West, my colleague, talked about using narrative and biographical approaches in research as a methodology, and Bill, of course, in terms of career education and career learning. So if I could move to the next slide, please, David. Thank you. So, there's a lot of C's there. So, Canterbury Christ Church University and the Centre for Career and Personal Development. So, we had conferences, as it suggests, every 2 years. And Bill was always at the conference, always presented, and always wrote in the occasional paper afterwards. Bill was also a visiting senior academic who would give seminars to our students. And when we used to say, or Bill Law, or indeed Tony Law, they're coming to give a seminar to you this afternoon, it was always met with, what, the Bill Law, the Tony Watts? We were very, very fortunate. So the conference itself, Challenging Biographies, was about relocating, we felt, the theory and practice of careers work. And the publication itself, as well as the conference, had this particular, can't actually see the slide properly, hang on, got my own here, particular aim to challenge narrow and overly classified approaches to career education and guidance in the context of the dynamic experience of real people in their real lives. And Bill's presentation and chapter in that publication was called Guidance, Too Many Lists and Not Enough Stories, which is a much better way of saying what that rather complicated previous bullet point is trying to say, I think. And it's a Billism. It's one that's gone through with me as I've worked to think about narrative and career guidance and counselling. It's one of those things to remember. Phil mentioned one. Lynn mentioned one the other day, I think, which was if you're not confused, you're not paying attention. You know, so these are the words of Bill that remain with us. Bill's core argument, which the rest of us in the publication would have agreed with, was that narrative thinking is more congruent with the way people learn across cultures and contexts. And there's a quote there from the occasional paper from Bill. The link between story and learning is ageless. Sagas, myths, legends, fables and parables are among the earliest teaching and learning methods. Contemporary educators understand the value both of stories that we tell and stories that learners tell, those telling tales, and always, of course, about learning with Bill. So if I could have the next slide, please, David. Thank you. So what I'm going to try to do now is attempt a synthesis of the synthesis, which was the last chapter in the occasional paper. And as Phil said, anything that you try to do when you try to summarise immediately becomes reductive. But forgive me for that, and I'll try to say a little bit about this. So the final chapter in the occasional paper was trying to address some of the questions that were raised at the conference, and also some of the questions that the presenters themselves had about using narrative in career education, guidance and counselling. And the chapter was, and indeed the paper, was edited by Andrew Edwards, who was the head of the centre at the time. And sadly, Andrew died not long after Bill. Andrew also had many links and years with NICEC too. So when we were thinking about what was to go in this final chapter, Andrew was sending around emails to the three of us and said to me one day, I'm still not sure what we should put in this final chapter. And I said, well, Andrew, I think we're already doing it. And I offered then to collate the emails, and then Andrew edited it into this final chapter. It's a very rich chapter, but when I looked through it the other day, I thought, oh, this is actually quite good, even though I do so say myself, but there we go. What I'm going to do is to talk about, or try to talk a little bit about some of Bill's responses to the very important questions that were raised. One of the things Bill was at pains to point out, we've already touched on this, was Bill's use of a vast range of disciplines actually, and of his reading, some of which it was really quite difficult stuff in terms of what he approached in order to inform his own thinking. But in particular, in terms of using narrative in career education and guidance and counselling, he drew a lot on the use of literary theory. He also wanted to ensure that people understood that this was beyond the individual story. It was always about socially situated learning, which Phil has already touched on. One of the questions that arose about using narrative in career guidance and counselling is, well, what happens if the story that people tell is something that's traumatic or something that they find quite upsetting? And Bill's response to that question was, yes, but all stories are progressive in the sense that they move on, i.e. these are stories that need to be heard if the individual, of course, wishes to tell them. Another question was about truth. Well, we could do 3 hours on truth, couldn't we? But what Bill said was what's important is what's true to the individual in their own situations. And storytelling, of course, doesn't exclude reality. Also, something that's been raised a number of times, which we also discussed in the final chapter, was what about the practicality of using narrative and biographical approaches? It sounds as if it's going to take a long time. Mark Savickas would say, no, it doesn't have to take a long time. But Bill was saying, what do we mean when we talk about practical? When people talk about practical, does the opposite mean that impractical means that it's expensive? When we talk about practical, does it mean that it has to be cheap? Funding, as we know, is always an issue in the world of education, let alone the world of career education and guidance. Practicals also means, will it work? And there's plenty of evidence, I think, now, beyond 2002, of different ways of doing narrative and biographical work, which does work. Not all the time with all the people, but there's plenty of evidence out there in many publications that we'll be familiar with. So one of the things Bill was paying attention to in that final chapter was how using storying techniques increases understanding, insight, and appreciation of application to a learner's own life by hearing other people's stories and relating them to our own, but also developing our own story. And what he said was the exclusive use of lists will obscure that understanding. So as we move to the end of the chapter, one of the things that Bill talked about was the need for a strategy using some of the principal features of narrative in order to identify what we are doing already that uses narrative productively, and what we are doing which may be counterproductive, both in any of the techniques we might be using, but also in terms of narrative as well. So that need to always have a critical approach to our work, and what new narrative techniques can be imported, always bearing in mind that we can't just impose from one culture, let's say, to another, and what needs to be developed. And he said the development of cost-effective practical applications here is key. And of course, storyboarding and the Career Learning Cafe being two of Bill's significant contributions at this time. Next slide, please, David. So, drawing then on the NICEC journal in October 2017 and the chapter I wrote in there, Bill Law's contribution to narrative in careers, work, a story to be told. I'll say something first of all about the term careers work. As we know, definitions of career education, career guidance, career learning, career counselling can be pages long. And Bill and I discussed this use of the word careers work. And in the end, after a Bill discussion, we decided that it was good enough. It was good enough to encompass all the things that make up the important sector that we work in. So around 2007 and the development of storyboarding for career management, Bill also developed the Career Learning Cafe with that fabulous domain name of hiho.com, and I hope you know it's still there. I understand it's managed by Bill's brother, I think that's correct. There is new material. No, it isn't. David's waving at me. In any case, it is still there. I looked at it the other day, and there's still a wealth of material on there. But with all of Bill's work, whether it's in his writing, whether it was in our occasional papers, the NICEC Journal or elsewhere, it was always about showing, not telling, and explaining the distinctive features of stories as developed in various techniques and in the storyboarding approach with clients. And it starts with these three areas, or these three episodes, if you like, so that where they're telling their stories of where they are now, where they might like to be, and how they might like to act to get there. And then storyboarding can develop further. And that three-stage, of course, is a model that we use in much of our work. So what does it help people to think about, to look at? What does it incorporate? Well, people, places, talk, events and meanings, but within the context of sequence, when things happen with other people, about points of view, an individual's point of view, and towards a turning point and change of mind. Civikas talks about in terms of a turning point. At that point, hopefully we can decide what to take forward and what to leave behind. So all of this, if you like, is serious playfulness. That's my expression rather than Bill's, but it highlights for me that it's an engaging way of working using narrative. It is playful, but it is also serious, and it highlights, along with these other things that I've said, the social justice ethos that underpinned Bill's work. And I have a quote here for you, which I'm going to read. "We, especially, need to understand the extent and dynamics of the damage caused by class, race, gender, and other stereotyping." And how current is that? "We really don't know how frequently or how intensively that kind of damage is done. Storyboarding can help us to find out, and also find out what happens to transform habit of mind into a change of mind." Next slide, please, David. So one of the things that we're looking at in this seminar is Bill's ongoing contribution to the work. And one of the things that I would say that Bill's work has provided is that safe space to encourage curiosity. Bill talks about the power of narrative and makes it clear that this isn't just about people in rocking chairs telling stories. Bill's ideas are underpinned by in-depth reading and understanding, as we've said, of some very challenging philosophical writing and contemporary debate. His work is always creative, unpacked, and do you hear me using the present tense? I can't possibly use the past tense. Always creative, unpacked in bite-sized elements. His ideas shared and tested with others, including significantly with practitioners. And I think that's very, very important, that Bill would share his ideas with a number of people, including practitioners, when they were being formed. So narrative approaches in careers education and guidance are seen by Bill as a way to radically expand the careers work repertoire. And I underlined repertoire because he didn't see this as the only way of working. It's part of, we've used that expression many times, the toolbox that practitioners can draw on. It increases the agencies of individuals in terms of engaging with the complexities of geography, place, space, time, and culture. And Bill's ideas will continue to challenge our thinking about how we model our own practice. We need to remain curious to encourage it in the thinking of others. If I could have the last slide, please, David. So we're thinking about in the seminar today the relevance of Bill's work, and in my case, narrative developments for contemporary careers work. And I thought I'm not going to attempt a summary of that. I'm going to pose it as some questions. So what would Bill have said about COVID-19 and the place for careers work in what has become a very uncertain future? How can we help those affected by job loss and job insecurity or uncertain educational and training routes envisage a future narrative? What are the links between the social and psychological aspects of career work and mental health? And I know Peter's been looking at that. And what about the Black Lives Matter movement and Bill's commitment to social justice? I think there might be a number of research projects and certainly PhDs in those questions if they were unpicked. What would have appeared on the Career Learning Cafe? I can see Bill on Zoom. Look, there he is. I can imagine how active Bill would be in asking us to provide the space and time for these stories to be told and heard, to be paid attention to before we decide on our interventions. He has, if we look, already given us many examples of how to do it in his work. So thank you, Bill, and I still miss you. Thank you, David.
Thanks, Hazel. Another rich 20 minutes. We've got 74 people online, so I think the best way of managing people's contributions is if you could use the raised hand facility in the participants box and we call you in. You may have a question, I suspect more likely a comment, an observation, or your own personal recollection of Bill and his work. You may want to comment on things that I said, that Phil said, things that Hazel has covered.
I'm just finding it really, fascinating to listen to from an academic point of view that Bill's work has been such a powerful influence on practice and thinking about careers work for so many years. It's just wonderful, really, isn't it? But also there's this very sort of strong tinge of nostalgia for the man himself, and basically I think a lot of us are just simply sitting here missing him and wishing he was here, which must, I'm sorry Stephen, that must be rather hard to hear, but he's really been such a landmark individual, hasn't he, in our work, and it's fascinating to see it's still influencing things. As we mentioned right at the outset, the highly commended entrant to the award this year actually did take one of his theories and really do a fantastic job on bringing it into the modern day and thinking about an issue in widening participation, for example. So, have we got Anthony back?
Yes, got my internet back.
Oh my goodness. Well, thanks, Jane. We'll come back to the discussion.
I'll mute myself now.
We'll come back to the discussion, and if you're okay to go straight into your presentation, Anthony, is that okay?
Yeah.
So introduce another NICEC colleague, Anthony Barnes, who's going to pick up on issues of curriculum and professional development.
I'm a careers educator. I first met Bill in the late 80s, and it was at a TVI conference at Surrey University, which I was familiar with his work. I'd read about him, but I wasn't prepared for seeing him, this very well-dressed individual, always very smartly dressed, with ideas fizzing off him like a firecracker, but also with flowing locks. It was in the 80s, but his 60s hairstyle. I'm sure you've got fond memories of Bill. Mine is really about how he started in careers work in the 60s. He was an RE teacher in Surrey, which some of you will know. And one day the head hauled him into his study and said, would he do careers? He was a theology teacher at the time. And that's how I and countless other teachers over the years came into careers work. Bill recalled how at the time, this is a quote, careers work usually ranked as an ancillary service alongside lost property and fire extinguishers. We did our best in my case, he said, with my cupboard and its cardboard boxes filled with dog-eared leaflets. So that's what David referred to as 1.1, the cardboard box substage of careers information. I'd like to say something about Bill's influence and legacy and contemporary relevance in these two main areas, professional development and curriculum or programme development in school-based careers work, starting in the 1970s. Bill made his mark on the school counselling movement in the 1970s, alongside the likes of Douglas Hamblin and Peter Dawes, a lifelong friend. That was the subject of his doctorate, and he published several research papers while a lecturer in education at Reading University. And in 1984, his book on the uses and abuses of profiling was published. Now, the headline issues may have changed in relation to profiling. You know, we talk these days about GDPR and safeguarding and ethnic profiling and that sort of thing. But if you really want to get to grips with the underlying principles and the things that you need to think about, then this book is still hugely relevant. And so is this one. In the 1970s, Bill was one of this amazing group of individuals, I haven't got time to name them all, who were part of NICEC. And Bill then was Senior Fellow and Coordinator of Training and Development. And this was the decade in which a career development field really became established in Britain. The inspiration and catalyst for this, as Phil's mentioned, was the 3-year sabbatical that Donald Super, then in his 60s, spent in Cambridge from 1976 to 79. And in that period, we had a swathe of really landmark publications. Schools, Careers and Community by Bill and Tony, published by the Church Information Office. Career Development in Britain, this book here, published in 1981. Bill wrote a chapter with Rob Ward on his career development Motivated, looking at the part played by motivation in young people's occupational choices. And he also wrote a second on careers theory, a third dimension. In this, he argued that it was important to look at what careers theories said about individual autonomy and responsibility in relation to individuals' own career development. This was a theme to which he often returned. For example, in the 1987 SKIP NICEC Wider Concepts of Work project, led by Bill and John Story, who is here today. And you see it also in his later work on careers learning and the link with connections and citizenship education. I think one of the things you most notice about Bill is that he had this knack of updating his ideas for a changed context, a changed situation. And so when connections and citizenship came along at the beginning of the noughties, he was able to update a lot of his thinking to make it relevant. But going back to the 1970s, that was the decade in which the careers sector had one of its most impassioned debates between two brilliant academics, Peter Dawes and Ken Roberts, about the psychological and sociological determinants of career choice and opportunity. For Bill, it was about what most influenced people's chances in life, human motivation or economic structures. And Bill developed his community interaction theory in 1981, partly, I think, to build a bridge between these two positions, but also to postulate a mechanism by which the human spirit could triumph. NICEC had been established in part to build a strong triangular relationship between theory, research and practice. And in the 1980s, Bill completed two important projects with collaborators that I suspect are not widely known today because they've not been digitised. And I hope that the steps being taken by the CDI, ICEGS and NICEC to create a national careers collection will eventually remedy this. The first of the projects was this 4-year career guidance integration project completed by Bill and Catherine Evans with support from John Miller and Bill Beryl Fawcett, both important figures in the history of careers education and guidance in their own right. The integration referred to in the title is what we would loosely call linking curriculum learning to careers in Gatsby speak. It does repay your reading today Many of the difficulties that they identified in embedding careers education in curriculum design haven't gone away. The second project, funded by the Church Information Office again, and the DES, completed with Cyril Roberts, was a report published in 1985 on the Yorkshire project on the transition of young people from school to working life. No Certain Place to Go, a line by Tennessee Williams, was its title. And it has a contemporary relevance in that it was carried out at a time of high youth unemployment. And we're likely to see that rise again as a result of the pandemic. Both reports highlight the difficulty of using careers education as a vehicle for catalysing and carrying change in schools. I'd like to move forward a couple of decades now, in the 1980s and 1990s, because in those decades, Bill was the go-to expert on careers education. Bill was involved in almost every major national project about careers education. These were the decades when he became an enthusiastic and early advocate of using technology in careers work, an expert in open and distance learning, advocating professional networking, and of course, developing career learning theory, narrative counselling, and his work on career-related learning in primary schools. Now, if I say something about computer-assisted guidance, this was a very early program called Futures to help students with their career choices, written with Chris Jolliffe at Crack, one of a series that Crack produced. Of course, you realise it's on a 5 1/4 inch floppy disk, and I haven't got a computer where I can even look at that now. This was a later contribution. It was for the National Council for Educational Technology, based in Coventry. Some of you will remember Malcolm Hunt, who was the programme manager for careers there. And in this publication from 1993, Bill wrote an article called On the Importance of Interwagulation. The title is Pure Bill. He was making the point that career development is complex and interwagulated, by which he meant that every aspect of career behaviour is interconnected. So he drew the parallel between the 5 main groups of careers theory at the time and how they related to each other, and you needed to understand all of them and work with all of them to do useful careers work. And he saw that computers at this time were becoming interwagulated as well, that the different things that computers could be doing, if we combined all those, we'd be able to get some really powerful careers programs. And there's one line in which he says, indeed, so interwagulated are computers becoming that some enthusiasts are beginning to wonder whether we may shortly be able to get into genuine conversations with the first intelligent computer, maybe even introduce ourselves to a conscious one. So, Jackie, you might like to tell us about that. There is a footnote to this article in Bill's use of the term interwagularity. Bill acknowledged that he'd unconsciously plagiarised and misremembered and forgotten the source of Ted Nelson's concept of interwingularity. Bill suggested that wag for wing could become a guidance variation for Ted's term. Bill also wrote the workbook for the 1995 DFE DTI ED funded Getting Involved in Careers work. This was a resource for subject teachers and tutors and teachers in initial teacher training, especially those working with 14 to 18-year-olds. The resource itself was developed by Cambridge Training and Development, and it combined video and program elements on a 12-inch Laserdisc. That technology is also now sadly defunct, and I wonder if we can do anything about it. One thing I remember from it is that Sean Maguire was in one of the films. He was a child actor who just left the cast of Grange Hill and was shortly to join EastEnders. I'm sure some of you remember him. I think he now lives and works in America. More recently, Bill wrote a monograph for his Career Learning Cafe entitled Digital Literacy, Repositioning Online Careers Work. And in it, he uses an elaborate metaphor about the need for post-colonial careers work, in which educators equip students with the critical thinking and digital literacy skills to resist arbitrary and powerful interests seeking to take over the web. And as usual, whenever I try to encapsulate Bill's thought processes, I always come up woefully short. So I suggest you go on the site and look for yourselves. I mentioned also that Bill was an expert in writing open and distance learning materials. And I think the open and distance learning materials which Bill wrote are probably the source of his greatest impact. Having said that, I don't want to underestimate the influence of his monographs and his journalism. It's easy to forget, but he was editor of 50 issues of the NICEC Bulletin. That's what, over and above the call of duty. And he then went on to write a Points of Departure column for the NICEC Journal and all those blogs in his cafe. But as a writer of CPD materials, what stands out is his ability to handle complexity, to analyse, to categorise and classify, and to create progressive frameworks and models. They were always rich in words, but he also had a talent for visual presentation, graphic narratives, cartoons that he drew himself, photographs that he took himself, and to create visual organisers. And as Phil and others have said, not only was he skilled at writing training materials, but he was also an outstanding keynote speaker and college careers work pack was a seminal moment. It was published in 1991 by the Open College, and Bill worked with an open learning editor, Eddie Nazel of Learners First, whom he knew from before when Eddie had been a member of NICEC. And I still use and adapt some of the activities from the careers when I'm developing careers leader training materials. He also wrote things for the for TVI, this coordinated careers work pack, ring binder pack, which was published by COIC. Again, lots of good stuff in it. If you've still got a copy, if you can find a copy on your shelves. In 1993, Bill also wrote a pack for the Teacher Placement Service on careers education and guidance, which is extremely useful on introducing non-specialists to careers work. And I don't know if you remember the teacher placement, but wasn't it a great idea? And isn't it time we revived it? I just wanted to emphasize the groundbreaking work that Bill and Barbara did on opening up career-related learning in primary schools. It's always sort of been there just below the radar, but I think it's coming back again. And but for COVID-19, I think we were going to see quite an interesting era of curriculum development, where now that Ofsted have said it's the quality of the curriculum that's important, that we were going to see a return to school-based curriculum development. And I hope that that will still happen. I think that this is part of the contemporary relevance of Bill, that we will be able to go back to opening doors and first impressions, which Barbara wrote for the DFES. So that's a hope I have about later on. There's so much more that we could say about that. Can you still hear me? Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Okay. So Bill was the go-to person in the 80s and 90s. In the noughties, Bill's thinking reached a new audience when he updated his work on life role relevance in the curriculum. This emphasis on role was not new. We've already referred to it as being part of the DOTS thinking, but also in the National Curriculum Council pack called Curriculum Guidance, 6 Careers, Education and Guidance, which Bill and Tony did unacknowledged and unaccredited work on. They rooted the careers education curriculum in 6 key concepts: self, careers, role, work and transition. And I think that underpinning the curriculum with strong conceptual frameworks like that is a really incredibly powerful approach to curriculum development in careers. So asking the question, is your curriculum life role relevant, was extremely important in Bill's thinking. And sadly, Bill produced his paper on life role relevance in the curriculum for the qualifications of Curriculum Authority, who were then revising the national curriculum. It was 2006. But when the change of government occurred in 2010, the planned reform of the primary curriculum was dropped. So I don't know if, you know, what might have been. So I'll start to wind up now. I haven't had time to talk about his local influence in areas of the UK or his influence abroad, especially in the other European countries. But I want to finish by highlighting another side of Bill that really stood out, which was his ability to come up with memorable phrases. We've heard the one about, if you're not confused, you're not paying attention. That was, again, pure Bill. And what he was referring to there was the complexity and liquidity of contemporary realities, meaning that the careers sector has an ever more complicated role, and simplistic approaches, you know, simply transmissive programs of careers education are not good enough. Do you remember a government series called Better Choices? Bill came up with an idea for a new series. He wanted to call it Even Better Choices. Is there life after DOTS? Careers education, forever clinging to the edge of the timetable. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the National Curriculum. These are all phrases that come to mind. But in thinking about the essential features of his legacy, I want to refer to where he stood on the tension between meta-knowledge, i.e. information about knowledge, and tacit knowledge, the unexamined practice. And for Bill, it was never enough to know what to do and how to do it. He believed that careers professionals should also know why they were doing it. And those of you who are involved in training and school support roles know that managing this tension is still one of the most difficult things. He also believed in the importance of being innovative as opposed to routine professionals, pushing the boundaries, embracing progress and change. And he also believed in the importance of networked communities of professionals. This was what inspired the NICEC network, and his career learning network and are part of that. So I've mentioned one thing about his contemporary relevance, that he wanted school-owned curriculum development, and we might see that come back. There is another relevance, isn't there? Only a few days ago, the Prime Minister announced an opportunity guarantee of an when Bill and John Morris produced the curriculum pack, Is It Working, in 1987, which was targeted on TBI ITS courses. It's understandable the teaching materials have dated, but the philosophy of the pack hasn't. And the management file focuses on ways of nurturing the autonomy of young people.
Thank you for persevering, Anthony, to the end. Thank you to my colleagues, 3 colleagues, for some really rich presentations, showing the breadth and depth of Bill's work, and lots of very supportive comments in the chat column. There's a couple of questions that have been raised in the chat column, one of which came from Fiona Christie asking where did Bill get his ideas from, and did he engage in any empirical research, or was he a thinker, philosopher, teacher? And somebody else has asked, AJ, I think, saying was Bill's work influenced by Donald Super, or did he influence Donald Super, or was it a two-way thing? And I just wonder, given that somebody earlier asked whether, as Tony is online, whether Tony would like to say something, but Tony's probably in the best position to answer those two questions because he worked alongside him alongside Bill throughout his time in NICEC. So could we invite you, Tony, to unmute your microphone and make any observation you might have on what we've covered in the last hour, but particularly those 2 points about where did Bill get his ideas from, and what was his relationship in terms of influencing Donald Super's work or being influenced by Donald Super's work. Tony, welcome.
Okay, well, thank you, David. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Good. Yeah. Just to answer a couple of those specifics, and then if I just make one or two general comments. He did do, his PhD was actually a statistical study of the role of counsellors with a lot of data. But I think he was less interested in that, really. He did move away from it. He was much more interested in qualitative issues. So it was one-off, but he showed he could do it. I think the issue about who influenced whom, I think by the time Don Super was with us, he was coming towards the end of his career. He had a bit of some health problems. Although we had some terrific conversations, I don't think his thinking, I mean, I had some correspondence with Phil about this, I don't think his thinking moved too much on. I think had it done so, it would have been significantly influenced, but I don't think at that point in his career he was really able to do that. But we did have some really terrific conversations, and with lots of other people. I mean, Peter Dawes, Ken Roberts, and a variety of other people as well. It was a terrific period. Is that the two specific things, David, or is there anything else? Is that all right? Just to make a general comment, if I may.
Of course.
Sorry, David?
Of course, yeah.
Okay. I do think this has been absolutely wonderful. I mean, 3 excellent papers and presentations, and I do feel that Bill's been here. I mean, we'll start with how those photographs, and incidentally, Bill was a fantastic photographer himself. I mean, some of my most valued family photographs were taken by Bill. But some wonderful photographs. But so many of his words that he's all been quoting, and I just feel he's been here, and I think he would have liked it. And I think he would have been quite impressed, actually, curiously, I think, by the other lack of confusion, but I think he would feel we have been paying attention.
Thank you. Fiona, are you still on the line, Fiona Christie?
I am. Can you hear me, David?
Did that answer your question?
Yes, partially. It was interesting because I think that, I have to admit that I'm less familiar with Bill Law's work than sort of many other people. So I was just struck as I was listening that people were very much talking about his theories and his ideas, and I was curious about where those ideas came from. And he did appear almost to be more a thinker, a philosopher, a public intellectual, as opposed to somebody who would be, and Tony mentioned doing statistical analysis. Obviously with research you can do lots of detailed qualitative work as well, really. So he seemed to do, or people have talked less about how he may have tested out his theories with empirical research, whether it's quantitative or qualitative or whatever, than actually what his ideas were. So that's just what I would add, really.
Thanks, Fiona. There's an interesting comment that Deirdre Hughes has joined the seminar, put up in the chat room, that another one of Bill's many international colleagues, Franz Myers, who has also sadly recently died. Deirdre's made the point, if Franz was still alive today, he would say Bill was a philosopher, inspirational and nurtured people as he came into contact with. So, and that's endorsed by somebody else who's just contributed to the column. If anybody else would like to contribute to the discussion or make a comment, an observation or a personal recollection of working with Bill, being in the audience with Bill, meeting him, reading his work, please contribute.
This is a very nerdy point about career theory, but I'm afraid that's what I teach, so that's what I'm into. One thing that I think was touched on in both Phil's presentation and his presentation in relation to community interaction theory and this debate between Dawes and Roberts at the end of the 70s. One thing I think Bill Law's work was very innovative in is highlighting the importance of levels of analysis. So you had this very individualistic psychological theory and this very macro level sociological and economic analysis of careers, and there was not much in the middle, but Bill identified that there was a middle, there was a mid-range level of analysis, and it's all about the individual in their social context and how the individual internalizes local social influences, stuff like that. So he identified that at the beginning of the 80s, and since then the vast majority of career theory has been around that area, how the individual internalizes and is influenced by and influences their local social world. So both psychology and sociological theories tend to be pitched around that level. So I think Bill should get credit for getting there, getting to that point first. So I just wanted to get my nerdiness out there. Thank you.
Anybody else?
Yep. Can I make just a very personal observation about Bill relating to the point about nurturing? I mean, I've always suffered from imposter syndrome in this field because I've been reading about it, talking about it, writing about it for 30 years, but I never actually did it myself. And one of the things I always felt about Bill and the conversations one had with him was the extraordinary respect, sympathy and interest he gave you, even when you were talking nonsense. And sometimes I felt, you know, he teased out what was wrong with the argument and helped you to put it right without ever patronizing, without ever having the sense this is somebody who knows so much more about this and has so much more experience. And it was a really, really fruitful relationship, though probably in terms of the number of hours I spent talking to him, a handful at the most, mostly at NICEC meetings. But I thought had enormous respect for him for that, for his sense that he was interested in what you thought. He didn't ever give the impression he thought you were talking nonsense, and he helped you to talk sense.
Lovely.
David, perhaps I could come in just to... Hi there, everyone. Lovely to see you all. Just to say an example of, I once attended a meeting with Bill when I was at NICEC, and it was with a leading academic at Bristol University. And it was part of developing a psychometric tool on decision making. And the colleague whose name escapes me from Bristol, he tried to blind us with science. And I was bowled over by Bill's, first of all, his modesty. And then secondly, once this chap had finished telling us things that he kept saying we probably wouldn't know anything about, Bill just, you know, spoke the language around quantitative analysis. And when we came out, I said, Bill, you're a really dark horse. And he said, you know, oh, Deirdre, there's a lot of things that people sometimes think in the careers profession, you know, we're all touchy-feely people. He said, we're all dark horses in our own way. And I always remember that, thinking, you know, he was so modest, really, in his ability, and yet so talented. So I just wanted to share that little illustration, really.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't know whether Rita is on the line, who put a comment up 10 minutes ago about saying in Denmark, Bill has had a great influence and still has. I said in my opening remarks that there's a group meeting tonight in Denmark to participate in this. So if they haven't got pizza or popcorn in their mouth, I don't know if somebody from Denmark would like to elaborate on that and just tell us a little bit more about how Bill's influenced things in Denmark. Rita.
Yeah, hi everyone.
Hi.
Well, I'm not among the pizza party.
All right.
I'm all by myself here.
Okay.
Well, well, he has had a great influence in Denmark. We've been working with his theories for the past, well, 10 years or something like that, very intensively, but he's been known for all the years back. Some of you may know Rie Thomsen, professor from the University of Aarhus, and we have together done several projects which was built on Bill Law's theory, and somehow his theory made the projects live among the people who attended the projects, because he was at the same time very philosophical, but also very easily understood. His ideas is easily understood somehow, and I think that's part of the explanation why he could, well, be the foundation for many people to get into these projects that we've been working with. I wanted to share a little anecdote with you, because I once asked Bill Law why on earth he named his homepage Hi Ho, Hi Ho. And then he just looked at me and he said, "I'll tell you, that's because you will never forget it." And I think that was incredible, a very good answer. And I never forgot it. And I tell my students about this, and they never forget about his homepage as well. So don't change the name of it if you put it into NICEC's homepage.
Okay, thank you. Actually, on that particular point, that several people have put a comment in the chat, just to tell people that that website, the Career Cafe, Career Learning Cafe, will live on as an archive that people can return to for forever, we hope. It's going to be imported into the NICEC website, which we're currently revamping, and as part of that revamping, we will import all the material in the next few weeks or months. My understanding of the name, and I'm going to invite Stephen if he wants to make one final remark in a minute, but my understanding is it's actually Maureen who came up with the name, that Bill and Maureen were walking through Cambridge one day on their way to the cinema to see a film in the afternoon, and there was Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was showing in the cinema as well, and that word up, the phrase hi ho, off to work we go was there, and it was Maureen who said that would be a good name for that website you're just developing, and I think he said, I think you're right. That's my understanding of the story. Stephen may correct that in a minute. Just before I ask Stephen if he wants to make a final observation, is there anybody else who wants to say something? We do try and finish on time when we do the NICEC seminars, because people plan the rest of their lives around it. Anybody want to say anything? Okay.
Well, I could say something if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Yes, because I'm representing the popcorn and pizza party.
Okay.
That is in Norway, not in Denmark, but Ria is a professor at our university here in University of Southeastern Norway as well. But and all my colleagues were supposed to come on popcorn and pizza, because I was the only one who got a ticket to the event. But it turned out everybody is on holiday except for me. So and we used Bill's theories a lot in our masters in career counseling, the program, and a lot of our students write around his theories in their thesis. So it's very much alive in Norway as well. Thank you for a great event.
Thank you. Stephen, did you want to say something, although you did make a remark at the beginning?
Yeah, very briefly. Yeah, I just wanted to say it's been very moving listening to you all talk about my dad, and not only the fact that he's had such a big influence, but, you know, some of the personal comments that you made about him resonated with me, and in particular the fact that a number of you picked up on the fact that he was such a good listener and was always interested in what you had to say. So it's been great. I really enjoyed it. I'd really like to congratulate Jackie and Emily on winning the the prize as they did. And I'd particularly like to thank David again for organising this event. I really very much appreciate it, and I know that my mum and my brother do too, and I'll be really relaying to them a great deal of what I've heard here. And if it's recorded and they can access it at some later date, that would be great too. So thank you to everyone, but particularly to David. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Great that you could join us, and do pass on our love and best wishes to Maureen and to Andrew. Thank you to all the presenters again, and thank you for everybody for signing up. It's been a fabulous 2 hours. It has all been recorded. It will be available. All the presenters are quite happy for their slides to be available as well. So you can revisit the material and pass it on to others who or pass the message on to others. They can see it as a recording if they're unable to join us. But thanks again for joining us. It's been a great celebration of Bill's work, and we'll carry on using it for the rest of our professional careers, I'm sure. So thank you, Michael, for holding it all together in terms of the technology. So have a great evening, everybody. Thank you.